There are people who move through rooms quietly, even when they are not trying to be invisible. They listen more than they speak. They notice laughter forming before it reaches them and fading before they can step closer. Struggling to make friends is rarely about a lack of warmth or interest. It is often about timing, fear, memory, and a nervous system that learned caution before connection. About wanting closeness, but not knowing how to arrive without losing something important along the way. These people are not broken. They are often deeply perceptive, emotionally tuned, and careful with what they offer. But the world does not always reward carefulness. This is a quiet psychology, one shaped by early moments, subtle wounds, and an ongoing tension between longing and self-protection. It examines the emotional weight of watching connections happen easily for others and the silent self-questioning that follows. The focus is on awareness, not judgment, how this realization slowly settles into identity. There is often no single moment when someone realizes they struggle to make friends. No announcement, no clear line in time. It arrives gradually, in the pauses after conversations end, in the way invitations seem to orbit nearby but never quite land, in the growing familiarity of being the one who listens, smiles, nods, then goes home alone. At first, it does not feel like a problem. It feels like personality, a preference for quiet, a comfort with solitude. But over time, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Friendships appear to form effortlessly around them. People exchange numbers casually. Plans are made in real time without hesitation or rehearsal. There is laughter that spills over, shared references that accumulate quickly, a sense of belonging that seems to assemble itself naturally. And standing just slightly outside of that flow is someone who wonders, without bitterness but with confusion, why it does not happen the same way for them. This awareness is not loud. It does not come with dramatic sadness or self-pity. It is subtle. A quiet noticing, a thought that appears during ordinary moments. Why does this feel so hard for me? Often, the first response is self-explanation. They tell themselves they are selective, that they simply have high standards, that they value depth over surface-level connection. And sometimes this is true. But beneath those explanations, there is often another layer, one that is harder to articulate, a sense that something about social connection feels slightly misaligned, that the steps others seem to follow intuitively require conscious effort here. Every interaction becomes something to be observed and evaluated in real time. Tone is monitored, timing is calculated, expressions are measured, not because they are inauthentic, but because they are careful. Carefulness becomes a way of staying safe, of minimizing misunderstanding, of preventing rejection before it has a chance to arrive. This awareness can feel isolating, even in company. They may be surrounded by people, yet feel emotionally distant. Not disconnected, just not fully included. As if everyone else received an unspoken set of instructions that they somehow missed. What makes this stage particularly heavy is that it is rarely acknowledged outwardly. People who struggle to make friends are often not visibly lonely. They are competent, polite, emotionally intelligent. They show up on time, they remember details, they care. From the outside, there is no obvious absence, but internally there is a quiet accumulation of moments where connection almost happened and then didn't. Moments where a conversation ended just a few seconds too early, where vulnerability hovered but retreated, where the impulse to reach out was paused by uncertainty. This leads to a kind of silent comparison. Not the sharp, envious kind, but a reflective one. They notice how easily others speak about their friends, how casually they reference shared histories, how often they use the word "we" without thinking. And slowly, a question forms, not about others, but about the self. What is it about me? This question is rarely answered directly. Instead, it lingers in the background, shaping identity quietly. They begin to see themselves as someone who is just not good at making friends, someone who tries but not quite enough, or someone who could but somehow doesn't. The danger of this awareness is not sadness, it is interpretation. When a pattern is noticed without context, the mind fills in the blanks. It searches for meaning, and without gentleness, it can begin to treat difficulty as defect. But at this stage, awareness is still neutral. It has not yet hardened into belief. It is simply the recognition that connection does not come easily, that it requires more energy, more courage, more internal negotiation than it seems to for others. This chapter is not about judgment. It is about noticing. Noticing the emotional distance that exists even in warmth. Noticing the longing that coexists with self-control. Noticing the carefulness that underlies social behavior. Because before any understanding can happen, something must first be seen. And for many who struggle to make friends, this is the beginning. A quiet awareness, not of failure, but of difference. A difference that has a history and a meaning. It explores how subtle experiences of exclusion, emotional unpredictability, or conditional acceptance shape social behavior. Friendship difficulty is framed as an adaptation, not a flaw. Most struggles with friendship do not begin in adulthood. They begin quietly, long before the language to name them exists. In early environments, connection is not learned through explanation. It is absorbed through repetition, through tone, through response. A child does not ask whether it is safe to be seen. They discover it. Some grow up in spaces where attention is inconsistent. Affection arrives unpredictably, warm one moment, distant the next. In these environments, closeness becomes something to monitor carefully, not something to assume. Others learn early that fitting in requires adjustment, that being accepted depends on reading the room correctly, that certain parts of themselves are welcomed while others are quietly ignored or discouraged. None of this is dramatic. There is often no single traumatic event. Instead, there is pattern, a pattern of being slightly out of sync, of speaking, then second-guessing, of wanting to belong, but sensing, accurately or not, that belonging comes with conditions. In school, this pattern can deepen. Children notice quickly who moves easily between groups, who is chosen first, who is invited without explanation. Those who struggle socially are not always rejected outright. Often they are simply overlooked. They are the ones who are tolerated rather than sought, included but not anchored. And while this may appear minor, the nervous system remembers repetition more than intensity. Being overlooked repeatedly teaches a specific lesson. Presence does not guarantee connection. Over time, this lesson becomes internalized. The child learns to observe before engaging, to wait for signals, to approach carefully or not at all. This is not shyness in the traditional sense. It is strategy, a way of minimizing risk in environments where emotional outcomes feel uncertain. Family dynamics can reinforce this. In households where emotions are not openly discussed, children learn to keep their inner world contained. In families where harmony is prioritized over honesty, self-expression becomes cautious. In environments where achievement is valued more than presence, connection becomes transactional. Again, nothing overt, nothing cruel, just subtle shaping. The child adapts by becoming perceptive, by noticing shifts in mood, by learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. These adaptations are intelligent, they are protective, but they come with a cost. When connection requires constant calibration, spontaneity fades. When acceptance feels conditional, vulnerability feels risky. When belonging must be earned, reaching out feels heavy. As adulthood approaches, these early strategies do not disappear. They evolve. The socially careful child becomes the socially aware adult, the one who reads micro-expressions, who notices pauses, who senses emotional undercurrents others miss. This sensitivity is often praised. They are described as thoughtful, empathetic, good listeners. But what is rarely seen is the internal tension that accompanies this role. Listening becomes safer than speaking. Understanding others feels easier than revealing oneself. And friendship, true friendship, requires exposure. It requires the willingness to be known before being certain of acceptance. For someone whose early environment taught them that acceptance was unpredictable, this feels dangerous. So they hesitate. Not because they do not want connection, but because their body remembers what uncertainty felt like. It remembers the cost of misreading a situation, of sharing too much too soon, of assuming closeness where none existed. This memory is not conscious. It lives in pacing, in tone, in timing. It shows up as a pause before texting, as restraint during conversations, as a tendency to let others lead. And when friendships do not form easily, the adult mind often blames the present self without realizing how much of this behavior was learned long ago. The truth is, many people who struggle to make friends are not socially deficient, they are socially conditioned. Conditioned to wait, to observe, to protect. They learned early that connection was not guaranteed, that being liked required awareness, that emotional safety depended on caution, and so they adapted in the only way that made sense at the time. What once helped them navigate their world now quietly limits their ability to enter new ones. But this does not make the pattern wrong, it makes it understandable. Before friendship difficulty becomes a personal narrative, it is a historical one, a story written through experience, not choice. And understanding where it began is not about assigning blame, it is about restoring context. Because what was learned for survival does not disappear just because the environment changes. It waits, patiently, until it is seen. It examines attachment styles, threat perception, and social anxiety as learned nervous system responses. Science is used to explain, not label, why connection can feel exhausting or unsafe. Human connection is not guided by intention alone. It is shaped by the brain. Long before conscious thought enters a social situation, the nervous system has already assessed it. Is this safe? Is this predictable? Is this worth the cost? For people who struggle to make friends, these questions are not abstract, they are physiological. Attachment research offers one lens. When early relationships are inconsistent, emotionally distant, or unpredictable, the brain learns to associate closeness with uncertainty. Not danger in the dramatic sense, but risk. Risk of misunderstanding, risk of emotional exposure without return, risk of investing energy where it may not be met. This creates an internal contradiction. The need for connection remains strong, but the system responsible for protection becomes vigilant. In secure attachment, social interaction is largely regulated. There is a baseline assumption that connection is safe, even if imperfect. In more cautious attachment patterns, this assumption does not exist. Instead, the brain stays alert. This does not mean fear is constant. It means attention is heightened. Tone is scanned. Facial expressions are analyzed. Silences are interpreted. What appears from the outside as overthinking is internally an attempt at regulation. The brain is trying to prevent emotional missteps. Neuroscience supports this. Social interaction activates the same neural systems involved in threat detection. For individuals whose past taught them that social outcomes are uncertain, these systems activate more easily. This creates subtle physical sensations, a tightening in the chest, shallow breathing, a slight mental fog. Nothing severe enough to label as panic, just enough to disrupt ease. Over time, the brain begins to associate social situations with effort rather than reward, not because connection is unwanted, but because it feels energetically expensive. This is where social anxiety is often misunderstood. It is not always fear of people, it is fear of misalignment, fear of saying too much or too little, fear of being misread, fear of realizing, after opening up, that the connection was imagined. So the brain compensates. It encourages preparation, rehearsal, control. The person thinks before speaking, edits in real time, monitors reactions closely.
This creates a paradox. The very strategies designed to protect connection begin to interfere with it. Conversation loses its natural rhythm. Presence becomes performance. The mind stays busy when it needs to stay open. And afterward, there is often exhaustion, not from talking, but from monitoring. This exhaustion reinforces avoidance, not conscious avoidance, but subtle withdrawal. They may decline invitations, not because they dislike company, but because they anticipate depletion. They may enjoy interactions while they happen, yet feel relief when they end. The brain remembers effort more than outcome. Another layer involved self-referential processing. People who struggle socially often have heightened activity in regions of the brain associated with self-monitoring. This means attention turns inward during interaction. Am I coming across correctly? Was that response appropriate? Did that land the way I intended? This inward focus reduces the brain's ability to stay attuned to the present moment. Connection requires attunement, not perfection, but the social brain cannot fully attune when it is busy protecting. None of this is a personal failure, it is learning. The brain adapts to patterns. If connection was once unpredictable, the brain learned to be cautious. If vulnerability was not consistently met, the brain learned to restrain. Importantly, these responses are not conscious choices, they are automatic, which is why telling someone to just be yourself often feels impossible. The system responsible for safety does not respond to reassurance alone. It responds to experience. The social brain does not need instruction, it needs evidence. But before evidence can accumulate, there must be understanding. Understanding that difficulty in forming friendships is not a sign of emotional deficiency. It is a sign of a nervous system that learned to prioritize stability over spontaneity, to value safety over speed, to choose observation over exposure. This understanding changes the narrative. The question shifts from, "What is wrong with me?" to, "What did my system learn and why?" And that shift, quiet as it is, creates space. Space for compassion, space for patience, space for the possibility that connection doesn't feel easy because it was never meant to be rushed. The social brain is not broken, it is simply cautious, and caution, once necessary, does not disappear on its own. It waits for conditions to change.
It examines overthinking, emotional restraint, and the exhaustion of social self-monitoring. Friendship becomes a delicate negotiation between longing and protection. There is a particular tension that lives inside people who struggle to make friends. It is not indifference, it is not disinterest, it is wanting, paired with restraint. They feel the pull toward connection clearly. They notice people they admire. They imagine conversations continuing beyond the moment. They feel warmth, curiosity, and a quiet hope. And then, something intervenes. A pause forms between impulse and action. A question interrupts momentum. A subtle tightening asks for certainty where none can be guaranteed. This is not rejection of others, it is self-protection. The inner conflict begins at the point where vulnerability becomes possible. Friendship requires exposure, not immediately, but eventually. It requires allowing another person access to one's inner world without knowing how it will be handled. For someone whose nervous system associates closeness with unpredictability, this feels like standing at the edge of something unstable. So they hesitate. They may engage socially with ease on the surface. They are polite, they contribute, they respond thoughtfully. But internally, there is a constant evaluation. Is this safe enough to continue? Is this person actually interested or just being kind? Am I misreading this? This questioning does not stop conversation, it slows it. Connection becomes incremental, measured, carefully paced. What others experience as spontaneity, they experience as risk. Overthinking often becomes the visible expression of this conflict, but overthinking is not confusion, it is vigilance. The mind is trying to prevent regret before it happens, trying to ensure that nothing is given where it will not be received.
So every word is weighed, every message drafted and redrafted, every silence analyzed, not because they lack social intuition, but because they have too much. They sense nuances others overlook. They feel shifts in tone. They notice when energy changes. This sensitivity can be a strength, but in the context of fear, it becomes exhausting. The effort to remain appropriate, likable, and emotionally regulated leaves little space for natural expression, and natural expression is what builds intimacy. As a result, others may perceive them as reserved, calm, hard to read, not unkind, but contained. This containment is not intentional distancing, it is an attempt to remain intact. There is often a fear beneath the surface that goes unspoken. Not fear of being disliked, but fear of being revealed and then dismissed. The pain is not in rejection itself, it is in the exposure that precedes it. So they protect the parts of themselves that feel most genuine. They share selectively. They wait for signals that rarely feel strong enough. This creates a loop. They want closeness, but require certainty. Certainty requires time. Time requires engagement. And engagement requires the very vulnerability they are trying to manage. Inside this loop, loneliness does not appear as isolation. It appears as distance within connection. They may have acquaintances, friendly interactions, surface-level bonds, but few places where the guard can lower completely. The exhaustion comes not from socializing, but from self-regulation, from staying alert, from staying appropriate, from staying composed. After interactions, they replay moments privately, wonder if they said too much or too little, analyze whether warmth was mutual or imagined. This reflection is not vanity, it is an attempt to learn the rules of something that is never felt intuitive. But rules cannot replace resonance. Friendship is not built through perfect timing or flawless communication. It is built through shared presence over time. And presence cannot exist fully when part of the self remains on guard. The tragedy of this inner conflict is that the qualities being protected are often the very ones that would allow connection to deepen. Depth, thoughtfulness, emotional awareness. But until safety is felt internally, these qualities stay partially hidden. So the person remains in a state of near connection, close enough to see what is possible, too cautious to step fully into it. This chapter is not about blame, it is about understanding the cost of protection. Because holding back is not a lack of desire, it is a sign that desire once learned to move carefully, and that carefulness, while once necessary, now stands between longing and fulfillment.
It explores moments of insight where self-compassion replaces self-blame. Not a solution, but a soft reorientation toward understanding. The shift does not arrive dramatically. There is no breakthrough moment, no sudden confidence, no clear answer that resolves the struggle. It arrives quietly, often in the form of a different question. Not, why am I like this? But, what has this been protecting? This is a small change in language, but it changes the direction of understanding. For a long time, the difficulty in making friends may have been interpreted as a personal limitation, a sign of something missing, a flaw to work around or hide. But slowly, sometimes without conscious intention, that narrative begins to loosen. The person notices patterns without attaching judgment. They see how they hesitate before reaching out, how they hold warmth behind restraint, how they wait for certainty before allowing closeness. And instead of criticism, there's curiosity. This curiosity creates distance from self-blame. They begin to recognize that their social behavior did not form randomly. It was shaped, learned, refined through experience. What once felt like weakness begins to look like adaptation. This does not remove the pain of loneliness, but it softens the shame around it. The inner voice changes tone. Instead of saying, I always struggle with this, it begins to say, this has been hard for me, and there are reasons. This distinction matters, because shame isolates, but understanding connects. In this stage, the person may start noticing others who share similar patterns, noticing the quiet ones, the careful listeners, the emotionally perceptive individuals who seem present but slightly distant. They realize they are not alone in this experience, and more importantly, they realize they are not defective. This realization does not erase caution. It does not suddenly make connection easy, but it changes the internal environment in which difficulty is held. Self-compassion creates space, space to acknowledge longing without urgency, space to recognize fear without fighting it, space to exist in between. This is not resignation, it is reorientation. They stop forcing themselves to perform socially, stop measuring themselves against others' ease, stop assuming that difficulty equals inadequacy. Instead, they begin to accept the pace of their own nervous system. They notice that they feel safer in smaller interactions, that depth comes before breadth, that trust grows slowly but meaningfully. They begin to respect this rhythm rather than resist it. This shift often brings grief. Grief for the ease that never came, grief for the connections that felt just out of reach, grief for the version of themselves they thought they needed to become. But grief is not regression, it is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that something mattered, that connection was desired, that the struggle was real. And within that acknowledgement, something steadies. The person stops pushing themselves toward a version of social success that does not fit their emotional reality. They stop asking why they cannot connect like others and begin asking what kind of connection actually feels sustainable. This question does not demand immediate answers. It simply opens space. In this space, self-trust begins to rebuild. Not confidence in social skill, but trust in internal signals. They begin to notice when connection feels aligned rather than forced, when conversation feels mutual rather than managed, when presence feels grounding rather than draining. These moments may be rare, but they are meaningful. They offer evidence, not that connection must always be hard, but that ease exists under the right conditions. The subtle shift is not about becoming more outgoing, it is about becoming more accurate. Accurate in self-perception, accurate in emotional pacing, accurate in expectations. It is the moment when the struggle with friendship is no longer seen as something to overcome, but something to understand. And understanding, when it arrives without pressure, becomes a form of relief, because it allows the person to stop fighting themselves. And in that quiet ceasefire, something new becomes possible.
It reframes friendship as presence rather than performance, and safety rather than speed. For many who struggle to make friends, the challenge has never been starting conversations. It has been staying. Staying emotionally present once the initial interaction passes. Staying open when uncertainty appears. Staying connected without retreating into self-protection. Healing, in this context, does not mean changing personality. It means changing relationship to one's own nervous system. The person begins to notice when the impulse to withdraw arises, not to judge it, but to recognize it. This impulse often appears after moments of closeness, after laughter, after shared understanding. Instead of relief, there is a subtle tension, a thought that asks, what happens next? For a system accustomed to managing risk, closeness can feel destabilizing, not because it is unwanted, but because it is unfamiliar. So learning to stay begins internally. It starts with allowing connection to remain unfinished. Not every interaction needs resolution. Not every bond needs immediate definition. Friendship is not built through certainty, it is built through continuity. The person begins to tolerate ambiguity, to allow conversations to end without over-analysis, to let warmth exist without proof, to resist the urge to retreat simply because something felt meaningful. This tolerance does not come from effort, it comes from safety. Safety built through small, repeatable experiences. Moments where nothing goes wrong after vulnerability. Moments where presence is met with presence. Moments where silence does not signal abandonment. Over time, these moments accumulate quietly. The nervous system learns not through logic, but through repetition. It learns that connection can remain steady, that closeness does not always require vigilance, that being seen does not automatically lead to loss. This is where authenticity begins to re-enter. Not the forced version, not the performative openness, but the simple act of responding as one is. Sharing a thought without refining it, expressing warmth without pre-calculating outcome, allowing personality to emerge naturally. This feels risky at first because authenticity removes control, but it also removes exhaustion. When less energy is spent monitoring, more becomes available for presence. The person begins to notice which connections feel regulating rather than draining, which interactions allow breadth to deepen, which people do not require constant self-adjustment. These are not necessarily many, but they are enough. Healing does not mean becoming socially expansive, it means becoming socially aligned, aligned with one's own emotional capacity, aligned with one's own pace. Learning to stay also means allowing others to see uncertainty, not presenting a finished version of the self, not hiding hesitation or sensitivity, but letting complexity exist. This does not push people away. Often, it invites resonance, because most people are also managing uncertainty, just differently. The difference is that those who struggled early learn to do it alone. Learning to stay is learning to let connection share the load. Not all friendships will deepen, not all warmth will become closeness, but staying long enough to let that be known is the work. And slowly, the association between closeness and danger begins to loosen. Connection stops feeling like something to survive. It becomes something that can be held. This chapter is not about resolution, it is about integration. The carefulness remains, but it no longer controls every interaction. The sensitivity remains, but it no longer overwhelms. The person does not become different, they become more present. And presence, quiet, steady, unforced, is often the foundation they were missing.
It reframes friendship as resonance rather than reach, depth rather than visibility. A quiet closing that honors timing, gentleness, and the courage to remain open. Belonging is often imagined as abundance, full calendars, group photos, shared histories spoken easily. But for some, belonging arrives differently. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not multiply quickly. It does not always look impressive from the outside. It feels like recognition, a moment where words land without effort, where silence does not need explanation, where presence feels steady rather than earned. People who struggle to make friends often mistake absence for failure. They count connections instead of quality. They measure themselves against a version of belonging that was never designed for their nervous system. But connection is not uniform. Some people are built for breadth, others for depth. Some move easily between many, others settle slowly with a few. Neither is superior. They are simply different expressions of the same human need. For those who learned early to be careful, belonging is not found by expanding outward. It is found by allowing something to stay, by letting a connection remain imperfect, by resisting the urge to retreat at the first sign of uncertainty, by trusting that not every bond needs to be intense to be real. Belonging, for them, often arrives quietly, through routine, through consistency, through shared presence over time. It may appear as one person who feels familiar, one conversation that does not require effort, one space where the body does not brace. And this is enough. The world often rewards visibility, but the nervous system values safety. People who struggle socially are often deeply loyal once trust forms, deeply attuned once presence is established, deeply capable of intimacy when allowed to move at their own pace. Their friendships may be fewer, but they are often anchored. What changes in the end is not behavior, but interpretation. They stop seeing themselves as late to something everyone else has mastered. They stop assuming connection should look a certain way. They begin to recognize that their path to belonging has always been different, not deficient. That carefulness was never the enemy. It was a language learned in earlier environments. And like all learned languages, it can evolve, not by force, but by exposure.
Belonging does not require becoming louder or faster or less sensitive. It requires alignment. Alignment between inner rhythm and outer connection. When that alignment occurs, friendship no longer feels like something to achieve. It feels like something to inhabit, a place where effort softens, where vigilance rests, where presence is enough. And perhaps the deepest realization comes here. Struggling to make friends was never a sign of incapacity. It was a sign of care. Care with what is given, care with what is received, care with what is risked. And when care is met with care, connection does not need to be forced. It forms quietly, slowly, and honestly. Not everyone will see it, but those who matter will feel it. And that, soft, steady, unremarkable to the outside world, is a different kind of belonging, one that lasts.